Welcome to Scandal Water,
where we cover the stories that have captivated the entertainment world.
I'm Candy, a longtime educator and community theater actress.
And I'm Ashley, a writer and co-founder of a local theater group.
We're two friends who share a love of entertainment.
From true crime docuseries, to blockbuster movies, to classic TV, to Broadway shows, and everything in between.
Each week, I share a compelling story related to pop culture.
And I chime in using my trivia junkie brain.
We stick to the facts until it's time to settle into our armchairs at the end.
Then we're simply two women with a strong cup of tea and even stronger opinions.
We're Scandal Water.
And if this sounds like your cup of tea,
follow the show on your favorite podcast app or the Scandal Water Podcast YouTube channel.
Oh, it's that time of day. Tune in and hear what the ladies say. It's time to bend your ear when the silver screen appears. Stories about the stage and screen and everything in between. So come on and join the fun. The curtain opens in 3, 2, 1.
Hello, Ashley.
hello, Candy.
We are back for another survivor story.
Yes.
I'm going to tell you, our episode last week was so incredible.
I know.
So incredible.
It really put things in perspective. If you remember for me,
Yes.
I felt like I'd had kind of a crummy year, and then I heard about Julianne, and I was like, never mind. I'm fine. Everything's great.
Well, it's just such an amazing story.
Yeah.
I did not think we were going to be able to approach that same level of, I don't even know what to call it, the same compelling nature of that story. But this one, I think it's right there with it.
Ooh.
I do. We are going to be talking about another amazing survival story. But I'm going to start, as I did with Julianne's, by reading a little excerpt. When his plane hit the ocean, Louie heard nothing at all. There were only soundless sensations, the plane tearing apart, his body hurtling forward, wires whipping around him, water over him, gravity dragging him under. He thrashed against the wires, and the plane carried him down. Louie was drowning. He struggled uselessly, sinking deeper and deeper, the water growing darker and heavier around him. He thought, hopeless. There was a bolt of pain in his head, then nothing. He woke in total darkness, sensing the plane still around him, still deep underwater, sinking. Inexplicably, miraculously, the wires had vanished. He groped along the wreckage, found an opening, and kicked through. He pulled the inflation cords on his life vest and felt it lift him. He burst into dazzling daylight and breathed. The ocean was a jumble of bomber remains. The lifeblood of the plane, oil, hydraulic fluid, and hundreds of gallons of fuel slopped about on the surface. Curling among the hunks of wreckage were threads of blood. Louie heard a voice. He turned toward it and saw Phil across the debris field, clinging to what looked like a fuel tank. With him was the tail gunner, Sergeant Francis McNamara, whom everyone called Mac. Neither man had a life vest on. Blood spouted in rhythmic arcs from Phil's forehead and washed in sheets down his face. His eyes lolled about in bewilderment. Louie looked around. None of the 8 other crewmen had surfaced. Yeah. This was an excerpt from the book Unbroken, a World War II story of survival, resilience, and redemption that was written by Laura Hillenbrand. Have you read it?
No,
Okay.
I really don't know much about this story either.
Okay. Well, she spent 7 years writing this book, by the way. It was published in 2010 and did make it to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. It was so popular, in fact, that it was made into a PG-13 rated film, also called Unbroken, that came out in 2014, directed by Angelina Jolie and starring Jack O'Connell as Louis Zamperini. Now, have you seen the movie?
I have not. No, that's what I'm telling you. I don't know much
Okay.
about this story.
Well, I knew
I've
you
heard of
said
it.
that you weren't that familiar, but I wasn't sure.
No,
Okay.
I mean it.
Okay. Well, today, Ashley, get ready.
I am.
Strap yourself in because
Okay.
we're going to be talking about the unbelievable survival story of Louis Zamperini. Now, before we go on, an interesting side note is that Louis' story actually caught the attention of the public way back in the 1950s when he was on the TV show This Is Your Life. And he actually put out a book, a memoir called Devil at My Heels, that was written with Helen Eitris, I think that's how you'd say her name, back in the 1950s. And this caught some attention. There was talk of a movie with Tony Curtis playing Louie back in the 50s. But when he landed his role in Spartacus, that kind of sidelined that.
Okay.
And then in the 90s, there again was talk of Nicolas Cage playing Louie in a movie
Oh.
after a segment on Louie aired during the Olympics, the 1998 Olympics. But that idea stalled out as well. And so it seemed like it had kind of been forgotten until decades later, after his original 1956 publication, Louie at some point found the diary he thought was lost. It had
Aw.
all this information about what he had gone through. And so he decided to revise his memoir, came out with a 2003 version that was again titled Devil at My Heels, co-written with David Renzen. And between his story coming back out, and we'll come back to this, but that 1998 segment that was released
in the Olympics.
Right. That's how it came to turn into this big project.
Okay.
With
Angelina.
the book and the movie. Yes. We're going to go through everything. Normally, of course, at this point, I would be giving you an IMDb summary, but since you are not familiar, we're going to skip that.
Okay.
And we're just going to kind of let this unfold and
Okay.
let you react as it goes
Okay.
as it goes along. So you really know nothing.
I remember when the movie came out with Angelina, but I don't remember.
Like what happened to this man.
I don't remember, other than it being something where everybody was astonished.
Okay. Louis Sylvie Zamperini, everybody calls him Louie, and actually later when he gets into the military, some people call him Zamp. But he was born on January 26, 1917 in New York, and in 1920, his family moved to Torrance, California, where, according to Louis, things did not always go smoothly. Speaking about his childhood, Louis said at one point, "My parents really loved me, but I kept getting into trouble."
Aw.
Yeah, Louis was, he was pretty mischievous. Some of this, I think, had a cause. Louis's parents were Italian immigrants, and Louis did not learn to speak English until he entered grade school.
Oh, wow.
Which he said made him a target for bullies. And in fact, his father taught him to box as a way to defend himself, which in reflection, Louis said at some point, "I was beating the tar out of every one of them, but I was so good at it that I started relishing the idea of getting even. I was sort of addicted to it."
Oh, he likes boxing.
He liked the fighting, so he did get into some fights, but he also got into a lot of other trouble. He was just a bit of a rebel, a bit of a daredevil. Here's an excerpt from the book Unbroken that might give you a little idea of what he was like. At 5, he started smoking.
Oh, at 5?
Yes, picking up discarded cigarette butts while walking to kindergarten.
Oh,
He began
gee.
drinking one night when he was 8. He hid under the dinner table, snatched glasses of wine, drank them all dry, staggered outside, and fell into a rose bush.
Sounds a little bit like Robert Downey Jr.'s young years.
On one day, Louise, that was his mother, discovered that Louis had impaled his leg on a bamboo beam. On another, she had to ask a neighbor to sew Louis's severed toe back on.
Ah!
When Louis came home drenched in oil after scaling an oil rig, diving into a sump well, and nearly drowning, it took a gallon of turpentine and a lot of scrubbing before Anthony recognized his son again. That was the dad.
Yeah.
Thrilled by crashing of boundaries, Louis was untamable. As he grew into his uncommonly clever mind, mere feats of daring were no longer satisfying. So Louis was doing everything.
He was.
Yeah, he found himself on the wrong side of the law quite often because he would steal and break into homes. I mean, he did a lot of stuff that actually had him running from the police quite often.
He's a rabble rouser.
Yes. And actually, all that running around turned him into an amazing runner.
Running from the law.
So Louis had a brother named Pete, who was one of his biggest advocates. And I'm sure there were others who were fighting for Louis as well. But Pete was somebody who had a nice influence on Louis. He himself was a fantastic athlete. Pete was in all kinds of sports. But he pushed Louis to become involved in track and field as a way to steer him.
Get some of
in
that
a
energy.
better-
Get some
right.
of that energy
Yeah.
out, Louis.
Keep him busy.
Yeah.
Keep him off the streets.
Yeah.
Keep him busy. So Louis listened, and he shared in a 2012 interview given for Cuyahoga Community College that he was running in a race one day, and, he was just doing it. He wasn't really investing himself in it or caring that much about winning, even though he was doing well. But he said as he was running, he suddenly registered that there were some of the students yelling his name.
Ah, he's getting attention.
He said he didn't even think the kids knew his name, but hearing their cheers, hearing his name on their lips caused him to put on a burst of speed. He ultimately won that race, and he commented that recognition was a great inspiration for him. And he soon became very serious about running, and it paid off. Yeah, he was nicknamed the Torrance Tornado, and he was such a standout runner at his high school, Torrance High School, that he, while in high school, set an interscholastic record for running the mile that stood for something like 20 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was so good in high school that he actually was invited to train for the Olympics at USC.
Oh, this is why they showed his story during the Olympics. Okay, okay.
The University of Southern California, and he ended up trying out and making it to the 1936 Olympics and also earning a scholarship to USC.
Good for him.
So let's talk about this Olympic thing for a second. Louis was only 19 when he qualified for the Summer Olympics in Berlin, which means that even today, he remains the youngest American to qualify in the 5,000 meter track and field event, according to an article on the U.S. Department of War website. So that was quite an accomplishment. And this is just me making an editorial comment right now, but in some ways, I feel like Louis was almost like that fictional character Forrest Gump, because it seems to me that he sometimes ended up in the middle of different historical
significant events.
Yes, because want to guess who one of his roommates was when he went to the Olympics?
Who?
Jesse Owens.
Oh,
Jesse
just
Owens.
a little guy named Jesse Owens.
Right. Now, I think there were actually 3 of them that stayed together in the room, but we are talking about Jesse Owens, who famously won 4 gold medals at the 1936 Olympics. Here's a little brief clip of Louis speaking about Jesse, and this is an interview I think he gave in 2012.
Jesse was, well, he was one in a million. I call it the prince. Any kind of racial remark, he would say, that guy's got a problem. And he never ruffled his feathers, and people just began to love him. His reputation hit Germany. When Hitler came in the stadium, there was a mandatory cheering, of course. But when Jesse came in, he got almost twice as much cheering as Hitler.
Wonderful.
Because there was an issue, right?
Yes. I mean, yeah, think about this. This was a black man going into
Berlin.
I mean, Hitler is in control, and we all know
how he felt.
Well, how he felt, yes. So I absolutely love that story. First of all, he said how classy and wonderful Jesse was, but the fact that Jesse got so much more applause than Hitler,
That's cool.
Loved it. But anyway, they were not in the same event, of course. Jesse did amazingly well. Louis, not so much. He actually finished 8th in the 5,000 meters, which, by the way, that's 3.1 miles. So he was a distance runner. He could run longer distances. But in an interview, Louis shared that as a Depression-era young man, he'd never really gone anywhere or had many opportunities, many luxuries. So when he found himself on this trip to go to the Olympics, he said he had no self-control. He says he put on 12 pounds during that trip. Yes.
That slowed him down.
It did. Yeah, he said that. But this is kind of cool. This is other people speaking about it as well, not just Louis. He still managed to leave his mark because he's running the race. He's behind. But an excerpt from an article on the USC website that includes a few words from Louis talks a bit about this race. Here it is. I was quite a sight, Louis recalls. Though I'd been behind, I sprinted the whole last lap, running it in 56 seconds after 3 whole miles. The crowd was going nuts. Afterward, as photographers snapped Zamperini's picture, Hitler's chief propagandist invited the young American runner to come shake hands with the Nazi leader. Aha, the boy with the fast finish, Hitler said to Zamperini through an English interpreter. So again, it's like Forrest Gump.
Yeah.
He literally was in the midst of this. He finishes 8th in the race, and yet his fast finish caught the attention of this man who actually Louis said he had no idea
who
Hitler was or what he was like at that time.
Of course
In
not.
a New York Times article, he was quoted as saying, I was pretty naive about world politics, and I thought he looked funny, like something out of a Laurel and Hardy film.
Right, he would have.
Especially the way he stamped his feet and slapped his thighs. And of course, he said it wasn't until years later he realized
Who he
how
was.
evil he was. Yeah. Well, after the Olympics, Louis attended USC, where he continued to excel on the track team, and he set a collegiate mile record that stood for 15 years. His intent was to compete in the Olympics again if he could qualify, but the 1940 Olympics ended up getting canceled due to the war.
Right.
And this is where Louie's life took a big turn. So even before America had entered the war, Louie enlisted in the Army Air Corps in September of 1941 and was soon commissioned as a second lieutenant. Now, my understanding, looking this up, is that this was the branch of military that later would become the Air Force. At that time, it just had a different name.
Okay.
Louie was a bombardier. That meant that he was the crew member who was responsible for making sure that aerial bombs got dropped on their targets.
That's sad. What a sad job.
Well, he also described it in one interview as being a really tough job because it was very technical. Like he kind of made, he was a joker. He always made light of things. He talked about, he would like lay down and take a nap while the pilot was flying. But when it was time to do his job, it was really technical. He had to make sure that the bombs were going to hit where they were supposed to hit. And he also commented that, his crewmates kind of were trusting him. If he were to mess up, their lives were in danger.
Yeah.
This was a pretty important job he had. Now, while he was training to become a bombardier, Louie formed a close friendship with his roommate, a pilot who was also a pastor's son named Russell Phillips. That was the name of his friend, was Russell Phillips. His nickname was Phil.
Oh, that's the one that's in the opening. Okay, gotcha.
Yes. Now, Phil was described as being very, very gentle-tempered.
Oh.
And his military rank was second lieutenant. So he was second lieutenant Russell Phillips. These two ended up becoming a team. They flew in a lot of dangerous combat situations together. In fact, according to an article on the United States Olympic Museum website, quote, during one run, their B-24 was damaged by enemy fire and made an emergency landing. Upon closer inspection, the plane had more than 600 holes from gunfire and shrapnel, end quote. Of course, it was Phil, the pilot, who had skillfully managed to get that crippled B-24 bomber back to base, which at this point was there in Oahu, okay? Their plane was totaled, but they all survived.
Okay, good.
So this brings us to May 27th of 1943. Louie and Phil were actually on their way to Honolulu to enjoy a day off when they were ordered to go on a search and rescue mission. A bomber had disappeared somewhere over the Pacific, and these two men, along with their crew, were told to go look for it to see if they could find wreckage or the survivors, something like that. So again, their own B-24 was totaled, so they were told to use a B-24 named the Green Hornet that shouldn't even have been flying, according to Louie. He referred to that plane as a mechanical mess. But this was their orders.
Yeah.
And so they did as they were told, and they were flying fairly low over the ocean looking for the signs of the missing plane and hopefully survivors when, according to an excerpt from the book Unbroken, which was published in a Vanity Fair article, quote, at around 2 that afternoon, as Green Hornet flew low over the search area, one of its 4 engines suddenly died, and the bomber began dropping toward the sea. In the scramble to save the plane, a crewman made a fatal error, mistakenly shutting down a second engine.
Oh, no.
Green Hornet fell from the sky.
Oh.
All right, that brings us back to where we started at the top of the
so
episode.
they weren't attacked. It was just something that happened.
They were in a terribly ill-equipped plane.
Okay.
And then there were some errors. Yeah. So here's the situation. This is when Louie finds himself in the water, right? So when he first hit, again, he thought he was going to drown. He was surrounded by those wires, the wreckage. He was underwater, unable to find a way to the surface. And that's when, as we heard, he managed to untangle himself, pull the inflation cord on his life vest, and that brought him to the surface. Mm-hmm. Now, as Louie's taking stock of the situation, he sees all the fuel, the wreckage. He looked across. He saw Phil with that
His
blood
friend.
literally spouting from his forehead, looking very dazed. Phil clinging to that fuel tank. And of course, we've already mentioned there was also a tail gunner, a man named Sergeant Francis McNamara. Mac, yes. But they're the only ones they can see. Picking up, this is the new information. Louie saw a life raft floating on the water, and he realized one of the crewmen must have known that they were going down, deployed it, right? Inflated it. So the current was starting to carry that raft away.
No.
And Louie's got a dilemma. Here's one of his best friends he looks like he's bleeding out, but Louie knew that if that raft got away, they were all going to die.
Yeah.
So he went for the raft.
Yeah.
Okay. But The current and the wind were moving that raft away faster than he could swim. He had on, he's in full clothing, shoes. He's thinking this raft is lost. But then he noticed a cord just a few feet in front of him, and he realized it was attached to the raft. So he used that cord, managed to pull the raft over to him, climbed inside, at which point he noticed there was a second inflated raft.
Oh, good.
So apparently there were oars in this first one. So he used the oars and rowed as hard and as fast as he could until he reached the cord to the second raft. And once he had that secured, he tied the two rafts together and went over to Phil and Mac. So Louie had Mac press Phil's carotid artery in his neck to try to slow the bleeding.
Yeah.
And then Louie had Mac and he himself took off their overshirts, and Louie pressed one t-shirt tightly against Phil's wounds while tying the other t-shirt,
as a tourniquet.
Right, to hold it in place. Exactly. And then Phil is so injured, he lets him get in one raft by himself so that he can stretch out and rest, and then Louie and Mac get they're in the second raft together, right? So Louie searched the rafts. He's looking for, is there anything in here? And he does find some survival items in the storage pockets of these rafts. Okay, here's what they had. Several half-pint tins of water, a brass mirror, a flare gun with flares, a raft patch kit, sea dye, a set of fish hooks, a spool of fishing line, a set of pliers with a screwdriver built into the handle, and 2 air pumps that were in canvas cases. He also found several thick chocolate bars, which was the only food they had.
Oh.
Okay, now, by this point, Louie knew he was in charge. Based on rank, it should have been Phil. Okay?
But Phil is injured.
But Phil is injured, and he literally said to Louie, you take it. You've got this. Okay, so it's official. He's turned it over to Louie, and Mac is struggling, right? In fact, at one point, he suddenly started yelling, "We're going to die," and he's screaming it. He's kind of panicked. He wouldn't calm down no matter how much Louie tried to reassure him. So Louie finally had to hit him.
Knock him out, basically?
Well, not knock him out, but he had to hit him in the face. Like he said, he hit his cheek with the back of his hand.
To kind of like snap out of it.
Right. He kind of shocked him into calming down and quieting. So, again, Louie is the one who's in charge officially, but he's also the one who's kind of got it most together at this point. He stepped into his leadership role. And he said, here's our plan. Each man is going to get 1 square of chocolate in the morning, because the chocolate bars were broke, they were designed in squares, Everybody's going to get 1 square of chocolate in the morning, 1 in the evening, and each man would also get 1 water tin from which they'd be allowed to drink 2 or 3 sips a day. And Louie's plan was, okay, if we do this, if we ration it in this way, this is going to make our supplies, our food and water last for a few days. That'll give us enough time, hopefully, to be rescued. All right. In the meantime, they're in their rafts, and Louie's just kind of using his hand to hold that t-shirt, up against Phil's forehead, just try to stop the blood flow. And they're just kind of hanging out at this point. And this is when some sharks arrived.
I knew it.
And
Blood.
the sun started to sink, which is where we're going to pause and take a break.
Oh my gosh. We love including listener voices in our episodes, and we're always looking for more. So tell us, where do you sip your scandal water? Do you catch up on the tea while folding your laundry, sitting at your work desk, working out at the gym? Let us know by sending in your shout out, telling us your first name, your hometown, and where you are or what you're doing when you're listening to Scandal Water. And you just might hear a voice you recognize starting one of our upcoming episodes. Email your audio clip to scandalwaterpodcast@gmail.com. The voice memo app on your phone will work just fine. Cheers!
And we're back. Where we left off, they were heading into their first night.
And sharks are coming.
And the men quickly discovered that sleeping overnight in the rafts was miserable. Now, the good news was the sharks did not make an attempt to come into the rafts after the men, but the sharks swam around and under them all night, even rubbing their backs on the underside of the raft. So they were very conscious of the sharks. The other issue was it got so cold.
Yeah.
It was terribly cold, to the point that the men actually put a few inches of ocean water into the bottom of their rafts as a strategy to help combat the cold, because what they said was their bodies actually warmed the water, and it got to the point to where their lower bodies were kind of okay, and it was their upper bodies that were like shaking and chilled.
Oof.
So the next morning, Louie wakes up, he goes to get the chocolate out, and it was gone.
Did Mac eat all of it?
Mac had eaten all of it.
I knew
He
it.
said that Mac stared back at him guiltily, but he knew that Mac was panicked. He knew he wasn't acting rationally, and so he just moved on. He did. He
Yeah,
kinda
what
let
can
it
you
go.
do?
What can you do? But
Push him
now-
overboard? You can't do that.
Yeah, so here they are, no food, and the fish hooks and the line, Louis said, were useless without any bait. They had nothing to do except wait and hope to be rescued. So Phil slept a lot. The sun beat down,
Baked
right?
him.
At one point, Louis and Mac heard a plane, and they saw it was a bomber plane rather than a rescue one. But of course, they still tried to signal it, first by shooting off a flare and then immediately dropping a dye pack into the water, which created a large pool of this like greenish yellow right around the rafts. But that plane continued on. However, the direction it was traveling actually gave them a bit of information about their own location because they have no idea where they
Sure,
are
yeah.
or which way they're drifting.
Right.
Seeing the way the plane traveled, they inferred that they were probably drifting west, which unfortunately was the opposite way from where they would want to go. They were heading away from the friendly area.
Yeah.
And they're moving the other direction. This made them feel a little worse about their chances for being rescued. The next day, the men saw a B-24 bomber plane, and Louis fired several flares, again with no luck. And of course, meanwhile, the rafts just keep drifting further to the west. By the fifth day, their drinking water was gone, and of course, at this point, they'd had nothing to eat for days. Mac snapped again, screaming that they were going to die, and again, Louis had to finally kind of smack him to get him to stop. But to give you a sense of their situation, here is another brief excerpt from the book. The equatorial sun lay upon the men, scalding their skin. Their upper lips burned and cracked, swelling so dramatically that the flesh obstructed their nostrils, while their lower lips bulged against their chins. Their bodies were slashed with open cracks that formed under the corrosive onslaught of sun, salt, wind, and fuel residue. White caps slapped into the fissures, generating an agonizing scalding sensation. Sunlight glared off the ocean, sending barbs of white light into the men's pupils and leaving their heads pounding. The men's feet were cratered with quarter-size salt sores. The rafts baked along with their occupants, emitting a bitter smell. The water tins were empty. Desperately thirsty and overheated, the men could do no more than use their hands to bail seawater over themselves. The coolness of the ocean beckoned and couldn't be answered, for the sharks circled. One shark, 6 or 8 feet long, stalked the rafts without rest, day and night. The men became especially wary of him, and when he ventured too close, one of them would jab him with an oar.
I can't. I know we talked about this last week. We talked about all the survival, and then you hear this stuff and you think, I just don't know.
Right. I mean,
I just don't know.
Okay. Well, let's keep going.
Okay.
So what saved them was the rain that came around their 7th or 8th day at sea. So this rain was so critical. It not only
They could
gave
drink it,
them,
right?
Desperately needed water to drink, but it actually was what their bodies needed too. It cooled their bodies. It washed some of the salt and the sweat and the fuel from their skin. So it was amazing. They knew they needed to find a way to save some of this water. So while Louis was still keeping his head tilted back and mouth wide open, catching as much as he could, he felt around until he came across the canvas case that accompanied one of those 2 air pumps. And he tore open the seam, he spread the fabric out to kind of make this bowl shape, and he managed to catch quite a bit of water in it.
Good.
But then a wave crashed into the raft and that water was lost. So now Louis started sucking up the water that was captured in the canvas bowl using his mouth, and then he would spit it into the tin cans. And once he filled those cans, of course, he's like trying not to waste anything. He's like, okay, start drinking some of this, as he would then keep replenishing, because he's all about, we're going to use as much of this water as we can. At some point, he also opened that second canvas bag, the one that came with the second air pump, so that they had another rain catcher. So they're just going for as much as they can. When the rain stopped and the sun came back out, the men realized those canvas cases also made nice hats to shield them from the sun. So they would rotate using those to make sure that they could get some relief. It was around day 9 or 10, when Louis was wearing his canvas hat, that he suddenly felt a weight land something on his head. It was an albatross. Laura Hillenbrandt described Louis's hand moving so slowly up toward the bird that it was, quote, little more noticeable than the turning of a minute hand on a clock. So he's slowly lifting his hand and finally gets to the point where he grabs that albatross by the legs, breaks its neck while it's pecking furiously at him, and then uses the pliers from his supply, little pile there, and they
defeather him.
They take that bird apart and they're going to eat this. But here's the sad part. That bird, I don't know if something was wrong with it, but it was so nasty, so smelly, the men could not do it. They could not make themselves eat it, as hungry as they were. But they could use it as bait. And that's what they did. So Louis took out the fishing gear, put bait on a hook, attached to a fishing line, threw it out. The sharks took it the first 3 or 4 times that he did it. But on the 4th try, he caught a nice sized fish, and the starving men were able to eat that.
Oh my goodness.
I know. More days passed. So one thing that we haven't mentioned yet, and this is important, and this was happening the whole time, and Louis gets a lot of credit for this as well, but Louis knew they needed to keep their minds sharp and they needed to keep their spirits up, because that is something that
Mac is not doing well.
Right. And he'd heard that, like this is a danger. You're out on an ocean like this, you could lose your mind, So Louis, from the beginning, and Phil went right with them, they made a point to try to pass the time, like quizzing each other on trivia. They would sing songs. They would ask each other questions, tell me about your favorite date. They would share favorite memories, talk about their plans for the future, all kinds of things like that. Louis shared in a documentary that I'm going to mention later that another thing they did was they talked about food nonstop.
I bet.
Now remember, Louis was Italian and he also knew how to cook some stuff. So he would start talking about how to make a spaghetti dinner, for example, and the men loved it. And it turned into this thing where they would ask him in particular, well, what are you going to make us for breakfast this morning?
Yeah,
and he would
so he's just describing.
Yes.
Oh.
And he would do it like they would go through breakfast, lunch, dinner. Then they started, we want a snack, and so that was so many things they would do to try to pass the time. But as time passed, as you predicted, Mac's participation in the conversation seemed to dwindle and his hopelessness
overtook him.
Yeah, it was really increasing. So by the time they hit the 2-week mark, the physical toll on them was evident in their face, their sunken cheeks, their pants are very loose. It was around that time, though, that Louis managed to catch another albatross, and this time they did force themselves to eat it. And in fact, in the stomach of that bird, they found some small fish, which Louis used as bait to catch a larger fish. One day after another goes by. Occasionally, what keeps them going is the occasional fish or small tern, or even sometimes a small shark that these men would catch that gave them a little bit of food here and there. And of course, the rains.
Yeah.
They would sometimes go like 6 days with no water. And then, thank heavens, rain would come. In fact, that was something that they started praying for. They would be praying for water, praying for rain. But again, Mac seemed to be fading the fastest, even though Phil was still in bad shape. Like his injuries really kind of set him behind. So he was in bad shape too, but Mac seemed to be the worst. It was around the 27th day.
Good golly, 27 days?
27 days so far.
Oh.
It was around the 27th day that a plane appeared. It was a twin-engine bomber, and it was so far away. The men debated whether it was even worth trying to signal it because they didn't want to waste their resources.
Sure.
But they decided we have to try, so they sent up 2 flares, and they also used a dye pack. And they even pulled out their mirror and tried to signal the bomber using the mirror. None of it seemed to work. They were so, despondent as they watched that plane fly away out of sight. And then they saw it make
Circle
a turn.
Ooh.
And it started heading back toward them. They were exuberant. They took off their shirts. They're waving their shirts. They're yelling and screaming, overcome with joy. And suddenly a deafening noise erupted and the ocean started popping all around them.
They're shooting at them, right?
They were being shot at.
It's an enemy one.
Uh-huh.
Oh, my gosh.
So all 3 of the men jump into the water. They're hiding behind and under the raft, and the bullets are raining down around them. When it stopped and they saw the plane was gone, Louis realized there were 2 sharks nearby. They had to get back into the rafts quickly, but the issue is Mac and Phil are both so weak they can't even climb back into the raft. So Louis has to go over and basically boost them in before he drags himself into one of the rafts, which he noticed was leaking air.
Fantastic.
And then the bomber plane came back.
No, because it shot it and it put a hole in their boat.
Yeah. And so this is when the men recognized it was clearly a Japanese plane. They had to get in that water again, but Phil and Mac couldn't. First of all, they didn't have time to have a big long conversation, but basically they knew they couldn't tread the water. They were too weak to stay in the water, and they definitely couldn't get back in. So Louie's like, what do I do? He gets in the water. They curl up in a ball and stay in those rafts, Phil and Mac do, pretending to be dead. And the plane comes back and shoots at them again. While he's in the water, the current starts to pull Louie away, and he realizes if he gets separated from those rafts, he's done. He's gone. But again, luckily that cord saved him. He saw a cord to one of the rafts floating in the water and tied that around his waist. And here's a little excerpt from the book to explain what happened next. Then in the murky blur beyond it, he saw the huge gaping mouth of a shark emerging out of the darkness and rushing straight at his legs. Louie recoiled in horror, jerking his legs to the side, away from the shark's mouth. The shark kept coming, directly at Louie's head. Louie rammed his palm into the tip of the shark's nose. The shark flinched, circled away, then swam back at him again. Louie waited until the shark was inches from him, then struck it again in the nose. Again, the shark peeled away. Above, the bullets stopped coming. As quickly as he could, Louie pulled himself along the cord until he reached the raft. He grabbed its wall and lifted himself clear of the shark. So he goes up there. Phil and Mac are both in a fetal position, and he checks, are you okay? Are you okay? They've not been shot.
Oh, good.
Neither one had been hit. And then the bomber came back.
No, leave them alone.
Louie had to get back in the water with the sharks 4 more times. That plane came back trying to gun them down. And would you believe it? Louie did not get attacked by the sharks, and not one bullet hit those men.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, I just feel so evil, but I know it's war, right? Before that plane flew off for good, they actually dropped a depth charge at those castaways, but it didn't go off. And Louie decided either it had been a dud or maybe the bombardier had forgotten to arm it. He didn't know. But
or maybe Phil's over there doing some serious praying, because wasn't he the son of a pastor?
He was. Well, I'm sure that was happening.
He's appealing to heaven.
Yeah. So although the men survived that attack, one of the rafts did not. It was lost along with all of the supplies that were on that raft. So now all 3 of the castaways are crowded into one raft, which has several punctures and is taking on water. And to make matters worse, remember we said the sharks, for whatever reason, when the rafts were fully inflated, they didn't come and try to get into the boat to grab the men out of it. It seemed like they felt like it was a clear boundary. But with this raft deflating and the sides going down, the sharks, and probably it was also because there was, people were in water and all this excitement, who knows, they were frenzied for whatever reason. These sharks were suddenly more aggressive, and for the first time, they were trying to attack the men inside the raft. So you had the men using an oar, taking turns trying to beat the sharks off, and Louie is trying to keep the raft inflated using one of the air pumps. Well, first he's using the air pump. He's trying to get keep the air coming in, keep this thing, inflated, and then he does get out that repair kit. And so what happens is it goes on for hours. We're talking like into the next day. The men are exhausted, but they are rotating, trying to beat off sharks, use the air pump. Louie's repairing the punctures. And in fact, it was something that Louie said, he'd struggled with Mac because of the chocolate, and Mac hadn't really seemed to offer them a lot. It felt like they were kind of having to really support Mac. And he commented they wouldn't have lived. They would not have lived without Mac. And he was so good at using that oar and keeping those sharks away, and he really felt like Mac redeemed himself.
Okay.
He was so grateful for Mac and for what he did, and he was it was a really, really positive experience, with him. So they made it through there. They got the raft basically okay, and they continued on. It was around day 31.
Goodness gracious.
They caught another albatross and ate it. Mac was so far gone at this point, though, it wasn't enough to save him.
Oh no.
Just a few days later, it was so sad. He knew. He asked, it was around day 33, he asked the fellas, he was like, am I going to die? Do you think I'm going to die?
Just from exposure, not necessarily injuries?
It was wasting away, starvation, just all of it. It was just this deterioration. And so Louie said he didn't he didn't think it was right to lie to him. And he said, I think so. I think it's going to be tonight. And he did. He died that night. Yeah. And the other two fellas wrapped him up in something. I think it was part of the raft that they had lost. And they said some words over him and they slid him into the water.
Oh, how sad.
Yeah. And the days kept going. The raft itself was starting to deteriorate because of all the patches and the heat. In fact, the book described it as becoming something of a gelatinous mess. And they thought they were heading towards the end. They didn't know how long the raft was going to hold up. They can tell they are deteriorating. One thing that they did do was they used the raft they had lost to create kind of a canopy over themselves.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah, at least they had some relief from the sun. But they are starving, and they know they are heading toward enemy territory. But they are looking constantly for land. They are just hoping and praying for land. And on their 47th day, they finally reached it. These two men had traveled something like 2,000 miles, had lost nearly half their body weight. In fact, you know how we always have conflicting information in sources, but most sources seem to agree Louie weighed somewhere around 70 or 75 pounds at this point. Yeah, they're both so weak that when they did get to land, they couldn't walk. They had to crawl. But after surviving a plane crash, 47 days at sea, attacks from a Japanese bomber, and so on, instead of being miraculously saved, these two men were captured by the Japanese and were now heading into 2 more years of mental and physical torture.
Oh.
This is this is going to be such a long episode. I apologize right now. They've made it through the ocean part. Ashley, we are now going into these two men becoming prisoners of war. This is the most unbelievable story. The most unbelievable story. I'm going to tell you right now, this should have been a 2-parter probably.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do justice to the journey that they went on because we'd be here all day.
Okay.
So I'm going to give you kind of a shortened
Overview.
version of what happens to them. You guys need to watch the movie and read the book.
Okay.
If you are interested in this. But this is just the most unbelievable thing. So unfortunately for them, Phil and Louie had ended up at a place in the Marshall Islands that was nicknamed Execution Island.
Oh, no.
Because the prisoners were treated so brutally there, and most all of them died. They were killed. Died or were killed. By the way, for the next portion of this story, I am going to use as one of my primary sources that documentary that I previewed. This was a documentary produced by CBS Sports as part of the 1998 Olympic Winter Games in Nagano, Japan. It was narrated by CBS News' Bob Simon, and I took a lot of information from there, so I want to make sure I credit my source. But Louie said that when he was put into that cell after arriving here, he said he looks down and he cried because he said here he was this athlete, who had been so strong and so powerful and, in such great shape. And he was just nothing but bones. And he is now captured. And the conditions were terrible.
He's already weak. So this is not going to help.
No. And the food they received was limited. And it was like the people who, the captors would like throw a rice ball in the middle of the dirt and the feces and all the things, and they would just have to pick it up and pick out the nasty stuff and eat what was left. The water was almost as scarce as it had been on the raft. It was not unusual to wake up with a rat on your head. I mean, it was just terrible. Yeah, and Louis said there was also this constant threat of being killed. This was a quote from him. They took great joy in telling us we were going to be executed, and they'd always go through the motion, like with a samurai sword. And he made that motion of like swiping across your neck. Every morning we woke up and we expected, well, this is the day. This is the day they're going to kill us. And one day they thought it was happening. Louie and Phil were blindfolded one day and led through the jungle, but it turned out that they were being taken to an infirmary, I believe. And there they were told they were going to be injected with a solution and that they needed to report everything they felt and how their bodies reacted. So these two were
guinea pigs.
Yes, they were being used for medical experiments, and this happened to them on 4 different occasions. And luckily, they survived. Although Louie told of suffering dizziness and pain and rashes and terrible things, but they lived through it, and many other people did not. So that was the one blessing. And then about a month and a half after they arrived there in September of 1943, the two were put on a boat and transferred to another POW camp located in Japan. Now, they were together in this new camp several months, and then Phil was transferred to a place the documentary described as an officer's camp in the South, while Louie was sent to a POW camp called Omori, and it was there that Louie first came into contact with a guard named Mutsuhiro Watanabe, whose nickname was the Bird. Now, to give you an idea of this man's character, in the documentary, one of the POWs who was under the Bird's charge commented that this was the kind of man you expected to suddenly pull out his sword and slice you down the middle. And another said the Bird was always quick to fly into a rage, and he would hit out at people, and he might be frothing at the mouth while he was doing it. Here's a quote from the book talking about him. Watanabe beat POWs every day, fracturing their windpipes, rupturing their eardrums, shattering their teeth, tearing one man's ear half off, leaving men unconscious. He ordered one man to report to him to be punched in the face every night for 3 weeks. He practiced judo on an appendectomy patient.
Oh, goodness.
He was so evil and cruel that it wasn't just the POWs that hated him. Reportedly, his fellow guards hated him too. Everybody regarded him as a sadistic psychopath. That was a term they used in the documentary. But he appeared to hate Louie most of all.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. So the thing is, the Bird himself had not been able to rise very far in rank. And so he had a thing against anybody who was an officer. People who were important in society hated them. People who were defiant hated them. Louie was all three of those things.
He's all of that.
Yeah, they knew he was an Olympic, competitor. They knew that he was important, and he definitely was defiant. And so the Bird took great pleasure not only in torturing Louie, but also trying to break his spirit, to humiliate him.
Yeah.
Because of his star power, Louie was allowed to deliver a message on Radio Tokyo that would be relayed to the U.S., and he was allowed to write his own message himself. Now, of course, it had to be approved and, pass the scrutiny of his captors, but still, he got to basically compose this message, and he got to read it. And he made a point to mention some of his fellow POWs in hopes that their families would hear they're still alive.
That they're okay.
Yes. Now, his own family did hear the message, and they were thrilled to learn he was alive because they'd actually already received a letter from President Franklin D. Roosevelt informing...
Saying he was dead?
Yeah, saying he had passed. A few months after this, Louie was again brought back to read a second message. But this time, he had written it out. He was ready to read his own message again, but they said, oh, no, you're going to read what we've written. And it was a propaganda-filled note, and he refused. They threatened to send him to a punishment camp, and Louie basically said in the documentary that the threat didn't faze him because living under the charge of the Bird was so absolutely...
He thought, well, that can't be any worse.
That's absolutely what he thought. I'll take the punishment camp. It's better than being with the Bird. So they did send Louie to that camp along with 8 other POWs. It was the, I hope I say this correctly, Nutsu POW camp in northern Japan. And they got there, and who steps out? The Bird.
No!
Yeah. In the book and the movie, there is a very, very famous confrontation. It's a very famous scene, and I'm going to play this short clip where you hear the narrator of the documentary. You hear his voice a little bit, but basically it's Louie and another POW telling about this confrontation between Louie and the Bird.
One day in April, the Bird ordered Zamperini to look after a sickly goat.
He said, if the goat dies, you die. Told everybody in the camp, the goat dies, he dies. And the goat died.
And instead of some usual kind of punishment, he said, pick up that piece of wood. He pointed to a 4x4 by 6 feet. And made Sam hold it above his head. And just hold it there. And said, wait. And then he went and sat on the roof of a little adjoining building, very low roof, sat up there in the sunshine, talking to friends, great fun.
For the first 3 minutes, I could hardly take it. Then I kind of went numb. And I was just frozen in that position.
And he was in agony. Every muscle strained, his neck, his eyes, his head, his face.
Zamperini, all 90 pounds of him, wouldn't give in. Finally, driven berserk by the Americans' resilience, the Bird came down from the roof and punched him in the stomach. Zamperini collapsed, the 4x4 on top of him. Wade noted the time. Zamperini had been holding that plank for 37 minutes.
That was a very, very important scene if you watch the movie, and it was that idea of Unbroken.
Yeah.
Yeah, Unbroken. It was just so powerful. I just wanted to make sure that we addressed that in
Wow. So he held a plank above his head for 37 minutes.
this malnourished, starving, probably 90-pound fella held it up there for 37 minutes just as an act of defiance against...
That just...
Yes.
Amazing.
Amazing. So as the POWs moved toward summer of 1945, they were encouraged because, you hear rumors, you hear news, and they were hearing that the Allies were winning the war. But they also knew they were running out of time. This was a punishment camp. Things were terrible here. These men were starving to death, and they were suffering severe brutality. Sometimes people were just killed. I mean, it just happened around them. But thankfully, Louie and his fellow POWs were liberated from camp in September of 1945 and returned home to much fanfare.
I bet.
Oh yeah, Louie told of a party where he got to dance with Maureen O'Hara, and he gave several examples, but he said for 6 months after he got back, he didn't go into a bar where his drinks weren't paid for by everybody around him.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and I know you'll be happy to hear this. Phil also survived.
Oh, good.
I was so happy.
I was worried about Phil.
So Louie met a beautiful woman named Cynthia Applewhite while he was on a government-paid R&R trip in 1946, and the two were married within months. But remember, the title of the book, the title of the movie was Unbroken, but honestly, Louie was broken.
Oh.
Yeah, he was plagued by nightmares, and the bird, he said the bird appeared in every one of them. He said the bird was in his nightmares every night. He shared that the entire time he had been tortured by the bird, he had dreamed of getting revenge, and this was the obsession that still drove him even after the war was over. And he said that at some point in nearly all of those nightmares, he would find himself in that dream trying to strangle the bird. And one night he woke up to find he had his hands around his wife's neck.
Oh no.
Yeah. And speaking about, this is clearly PTSD, but in speaking about this, Louis said at one point, I could take the beatings and the physical punishment, but it was the attempt to destroy your dignity, to make you a non-entity that was the hardest thing to bear. He turned to drink, and he was battling rage and alcoholism, and all this took the toll on their marriage to the point that Cynthia said,
no more.
I think we need a divorce. We need to get a divorce. But then in 1949, Cynthia convinced Louis to go with her to hear Billy Graham preach. And Louis had a spiritual experience that night. One of the things, by the way, that Billy Graham talked about in his message was forgiveness. And so he was moved. He gave his life to the Lord. And Louis said many times in different interviews that his nightmares immediately stopped.
Oh, good.
And his faith prompted him to focus on forgiveness instead of revenge.
Wow.
In 1950, Louis returned to Japan, and he visited a prison where many of the Japanese war criminals were held because they arrested the people after the war. His purpose was to speak with former captors. His intent was to offer forgiveness. In fact, he asked to meet with the bird, but he was told that the bird had committed suicide.
Oh, wow.
Now, in reality, Mutsuhiro Watanabe, the bird, who had been placed at number 23 on General Douglas MacArthur's list of the 40 most wanted war criminals.
He's that awful, and he's number 23?
Well, that's a good point. But still, he made this list. He had gone into hiding.
So he hadn't committed suicide?
No, he was hiding to avoid being prosecuted. And he stayed hidden for 7 years until basically the circumstances changed to where
he could come out.
Yeah, he was not going to be charged. There was basically amnesty granted to people who were war criminals. That's when he came out of hiding. Louis tried again to meet with the bird in 1998 when that 81-year-old, he was 81 at that time, former Olympian, got to carry the torch in the Winter Olympics that were held in Nagano, Japan, which was right over where he'd been kept.
Yeah.
He even wrote out his message, what he wanted to share with the bird in a letter format. But again, Watanabe would not see him. But all this time, Louis, that's when we had our documentary in conjunction with the Olympics. It came out. It was so inspiring. Of course, that led to him getting to tell his story again, and the book and the movie. And Louis has shared, you can look it up, he has shared his letter that he wrote and the forgiveness that he was able to offer to this man who was so just beyond evil and heinous to him. And as for Louis and Cynthia, they were married for 55 years and had 2 children together. She passed away in 2001, and we lost Louis in 2014 at the age of 97.
Wow.
Yeah.
Armchair psychologist.
Whew.
That is
so, isn't that an amazing story?
Yes, that is so intense.
Yeah, and because because you weren't familiar with it, I didn't have a specific armchair question. We are now at the armchair segment.
Okay.
I'm just going to ask you to give me your general thoughts and reaction to this survival story.
I just sort of feel like almost in shock because I just experienced his whole life in an hour. I experienced all of his 97 years in an hour. And I'm sort of awash with the resilience of the human spirit.
Yes.
And how badly we want, like we talked about last week, when you want to survive, how badly and how hard you will work to survive. And it has to be that want. I feel like with Mac, I feel so bad for Mac because he just, from the start, he didn't believe that he could.
Right.
And he didn't.
And he didn't. Even though he made it so
He made it so far. I don't think he would have made it through the camp.
No, probably not.
So it probably was, in a sad way, a little bit of a mercy that he did not have to go through that. Because if he wasn't going to make it through the boats, he wasn't going to do that. But wow, people are amazing and admirable. And I'm a little overwhelmed.
I know. It's so interesting because I remember this even watching the movie. And I think I want to say I read the young adult version of the book because, as a teacher, you try to read some things that, your kids are reading. But anyway, I remember with both of those works, it felt like we have finished the whole story. Oh, but wait, we're starting a whole new story. It almost felt
There's still an hour left in the movie.
Right. And honestly, it felt like, to me, 3 different stories. You had his survival, with his crewmates in the boat. And then you had his survival in that POW camp. And then you had his survival as a human being when he found a way to deal with everything. The forgiveness. Yes. And so it's just so incredible. And I guess to your point, to kind of follow up on your train of thought there, I recall that that's one of the things I did see and hear Louie talk about in the different sources was the fact that he felt like being an athlete served him well. Yeah, because many of those qualities that we talked about in our previous episode, he gained those, or he gained expertise in those through being an athlete.
His body would have been strong enough to be able to then lose the weight.
Yeah, but he talked about, being an athlete taught him, as you said, there was strength, but there was also confidence and perseverance and being able to push through pain and just so many things. And then and I don't know if there's a direct connection, but he felt like he had used his humor, like that was something that he used in being an athlete and going different places and doing different things. And he felt like that served him well in this too. But it's just unbelievable. When you would watch the interviews, so many of them, of course, he gave after the book and the movie came out when he was in his 90s.
Yeah.
You heard it as we were playing some of those clips. You could hear that he was an older gentleman and he was just so sassy. I mean, I just thought he was amazing.
So his personality really served him.
Oh,
that
absolutely.
Early defiance served him later.
Oh, yes. He would not have made it. I mean, on the one hand, his defiance made him a target for the bird, but it's also what helped him survive it. Yeah. Who do we want to cheers, Ashley?
Well, gosh, you got to cheers Louie.
Absolutely.
What an amazing man. What an inspiration.
Yeah, absolutely. Cheers to Louis Zamperini.
Cheers.
If you love what we do, please rate and review our show or become a supporter through Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon. Whether a single gift or recurring monthly donation, your support is what allows us to keep the tea brewing.
Subscribe on your favorite podcast app or the Scandal Water Podcast YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Show notes are available at our website, scandalwaterpodcast.com, where you can also access the merch store and more.
This episode was executive produced by Candy Thomas, that's me, and Ashley Raymer Brown,
that's me.
It was researched and written by Candy Thomas and edited by Ashley Raymer Brown.
A special thank you to Josh Martin, who wrote, composed, and performed the Scandal Water theme and other music, Matt C. Adams, who created the artwork, and Joshua Reith, who designed our website and provides ongoing technical support.
As a reminder, this podcast is purely for entertainment purposes. The thoughts and opinions of the host during each episode of Scandal Water are their own and do not reflect the opinions of any future guests, advertisers, or clearly professional psychologists. Thanks for listening.